Autism on video number 2 now. So on page 96, the book talks about how in scientific research there is a desire for parsimony. So this means that ideally there should be a minimum number of underlying psychological features necessary to account for a behavioural pattern. In other words, a good scientific theory will not be overly complex. It will want to kind of hone in on just a small number of features. To kind of like so that there aren't too many confounding factors at play. So this is prevalent in psychology, this desire for parsimony. But it's argued that maybe it's more convincing in autism to propose multiple primary differences at the psychological level and the genetic behavioural levels. So traditionally, autism research, because of this focus on parsimony, they've tended to kind of suggest that there's just one cognitive cause, and that's usually been the theory of mind hypothesis. But because there is conflicting evidence for the theory of mind hypothesis, some strong evidence, but again other studies that contradict it, maybe then we should be looking at multiple primary cognitive differences as well as multiple genetic or behavioural levels. So some autistic people, it might be more to do with theory of mind. Other autistic people, it might be more to do with executive functioning. Other autistic people, it might be a combination of the two, and there could then be other factors as well. So co-occurrence of multiple differences, as shown in the fractionated triad, different psychological factors impacting different aspects of a behavioural phenotype or a behavioural expression. A phenotype is how the genotype is expressed in behaviour of autism. And so it could be underpinned by independent genetic influences as well. So the late 20th century models of autism strove to identify a single core cognitive feature, the theory of mind most notably, that could explain all of the surface behaviour, but this cannot address the variability among autistics, and it cannot explain the other aspects. For example, the sensory aspect. Can the theory of mind explain sensory? It doesn't really seem able to do so. So again, that suggests that maybe some other explanation for what causes the sensory. And then something else I found really interesting is the kind of how autism develops over time. So this looks at the sort of developmental trajectory of autism. And it suggested that early small disruptions to the typical developmental process have larger downstream effects eventually recognisable as autism. So in other words, autism is not caused by some massive insult. It's actually potentially caused by a very small disruption. But this small disruption then has a massive impact further downstream. It brings to mind a little bit of a butterfly effect. I don't know if you've heard about that. A butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world can then lead to massive, atmospheric changes in another part of the world. So it's kind of like a sort of snowball effect. On page 103, this is described as, I'll just find it here. Yes, this is described as Waddington, was Waddington some scientist, I guess, Waddington's epigenetic landscape. So here we have it. I won't go into it too much detail, but I just thought it was a good visual to describe this, a sort of visual metaphor, as it says, for this process. Here we have it. So Waddington's epigenetic landscape. So, you have like a small little change, but that small change again can lead to a huge divergence later on. Your developmental path then changes. It says the landscape was initially put forward as a way to understand the actions of genes across the lifespan. It could also be used to conceptualise how early subtle differences can result over time in a radically different approach to the world, such as found in autism. In the image, Gaborka represented the child and his or her development, which unfolds like a slow downhill roll. Small differences in the starting position, direction, or speed of the ball, or tiny bumps along the way, could result in a ball following paths that diverge over time to become radically differentiated. The hills which separate each path could represent the significant effort required if one were to attempt to move later in life from one path to another. So it says, theoretical accounts of autism interpret these early small disruptions to the typical developmental process as having larger downstream effects which are eventually recognisable as autism. And I just think that's a really useful kind of visual way of conceptualising it, really. It brings to mind the butterfly effect. And then, of course, there are different theories as to what is, if you like, what is the initial kind of anomaly, if you like, however small, that later leads to these bigger downstream effects in autism. And one of these is the social orienting hypothesis, which suggests that the earlier signs should be the lack of preferential attention to social content. So the basic mechanism that prioritises attention to social content, starting with a simple orienting to faces and voices, is disrupted. So the idea is that autistic infants attend less to social content, thereby missing out on the opportunities to learn about social behaviour. Then, the lack of comprehension of the social world starts to reinforce the attentional difference. And so the child then starts to chooses to spend time and attention on non-social activities which are more comprehensible and therefore enjoyable. However, a number of findings suggest that in fact social attention and orienting are actually intact in many autistic infants, which contradicts the social orienting hypothesis. So there are studies that suggest intact social attention and orienting, but they have still found subtle differences in the timing of eye movements when viewing static social stimuli. So there's a question of whether the ultimate cause of different looking patterns is specific to the social domain or an information processing difficulty in general. So if there is a problem, however subtle, in social orienting in infancy, is this specific to the social domain, or is there a wider information processing difficulty or attentional difficulty that goes beyond just the purely social? And that's a question that is put here. Another hypothesis, and bear in mind these are all hypotheses, so they still need to be proven, and there's still controversy around them, is the social motivation hypothesis, and that would suggest that the early difficulty is not social orienting or social attention, but is instead social motivation. So this video doesn't run out on me, I'm going to stop now, but next week I'm going to come back to explore the social motivation hypothesis that social motivation might be the early kind of starting point, or the early anomaly that sets the ball of a child, if you like. If you think of a child as like a ball, in that visual landscape I showed earlier, that sets the ball off in a different course. But again, this is all hypothetical. So do let me know what you think in the comments box below, and I very much look forward to carrying on your review next week. So thank you for watching.